The wind howled through the thick trees as Sarah stared at the crumpled invitation in her hand. It was an old piece of paper with hard-to-read writing. The letter invited her and a group of friends to spend the night camping in Black Hollow National Park, a place Sarah had always wanted to visit. For years, people in town had whispered about it, telling stories of strange disappearances and ghostly sightings. But despite the eerie reputation, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she had to go. The locals talked about hikers who entered the park and were never seen again. All that was left were small signs, broken branches, bloodstains, and sometimes things like a watch or a scarf. The creepiest part, no one ever returned to explain what happened. But still, the invitation was too tempting to pass up. "Are you really going to ignore this, Sarah?" her friend Laura asked over the phone, sensing the hesitation in Sarah's voice. This could be the adventure of a lifetime. But fear twisted in Sarah's stomach. Everyone in town had a story, a creepy tale of shadowy figures or strange whispers coming from the trees at night. Even the bravest people avoided the place, saying that something old and unseen was always watching the park, waiting. But the invitation was just too mysterious for Sarah to turn down. With one last look at the dark trees outside her window, Sarah packed her bag. Little did she know, once she stepped into Black Hollow, nothing would ever be the same. The answers she sought were hidden deep in its shadowy woods, but finding them might cost more than anyone was ready to give. Sarah sat nervously in the car as it bumped along the winding road to Black Hollow. Laura and Ethan, sitting in the back, laughed and joked. But Sarah couldn't stop thinking about the strange stories she had heard. Each turn in the road felt like it was taking them deeper into a place where the trees were tall and thick and the air seemed heavy. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" Sarah asked, her voice barely more than a whisper as they neared the park's entrance. "Of course, it is just an old park with some wild rumors," Laura said, trying to sound confident. But her smile had an edge to it, as if she wasn't completely sure either. As they drove into the park, Sarah noticed how the landscape changed quickly. The trees grew taller and more twisted, and their branches were bent in strange shapes. The sun was setting and casting long shadows that seemed to stretch farther than they should. When they finally reached the campsite, Ethan, always the brave one, was the first to jump out of the car. Suddenly, Sarah's heart raced. This place felt different from anywhere she had ever been. There was a strange stillness, like the world outside the park had disappeared. Even though the forest around them was alive with sounds of crickets and rustling leaves, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching them. "Welcome to Black Hollow," Ethan said and tried to make a joke. His voice echoed in the silence, but Sarah could hear the uncertainty in it. The trees seemed to move closer, and the air felt thicker with every passing moment. Sarah suddenly had the urge to leave, but she shook it off. She couldn't back out now. That evening, as the group sat around the fire, Sarah couldn't help but bring up the park's strange history. "You guys ever hear the stories about Black Hollow?" she asked quietly, and her voice was unsure. Ethan glanced up from his phone, clearly amused. "You mean the ghost stories?" "Yeah, I have heard a few. They say a bunch of hikers disappeared here about 30 years ago, and some people think the place is cursed. They say the spirits of the park come after anyone who enters." Then, Laura laughed nervously and tossed another log onto the fire. "Oh, come on. It is just a story. There is no such thing as ghosts." As the night went on, the air grew heavier, and the shadows of the trees stretched further into the darkness. Sarah shivered, even though the fire was warm. She couldn't stop thinking about the warnings she had heard from the townspeople, faces filled with fear, telling her not to go. One time, an old man had told her, "People have gone missing in those woods. 4 years, and the forest doesn't like strangers." The more she thought about it, the more the air felt strange, like something ancient was waking up. Then, the fire flickered and cast eerie shadows that seemed to dance like ghosts. Sarah's thoughts raced as she tried to push away the growing feeling of unease. Then, Ethan said quietly, "There is an old story," his voice barely above a whisper, "about a group of campers who disappeared and then people found their tent the next morning, all torn up and shredded, but no bodies, not even any blood." As he spoke, the wind picked up and carried a soft, almost silent whisper. Sarah's skin crawled because she sensed there was something deeply unsettling about this place, something dark hidden just beneath the surface. The next morning, as the group ventured deeper into the park to set up camp, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. It wasn't just the rustling of animals in the bushes or the way the trees loomed above them. It was as if something unseen was tracking their every move. Earlier, at the local store before they entered the park, an old man had grabbed Sarah's arm. His face was pale, and his hands shook as he spoke. "Don't go in there," he warned, and his voice was cracking. "Not everyone who enters Black Hollow comes out the same. Some don't come out at all." At the time, Sarah had shrugged it off, thinking it was just the ramblings of an old man. But now, as they ventured further into the park, she began to wonder if she had made a mistake. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, and the trees seemed to close in around them, blocking out the sunlight. As they gathered firewood, a ranger approached them and his face was stern. "Stay on the marked trails and don't wander off. And for heaven's sake, stay away from the old ruins deep in the park. There's a reason no one talks about them." His warning hung in the air, but none of them seemed to take it seriously. Ethan laughed it off and dismissing it as just another superstition. Laura and Sarah exchanged uneasy glances but pushed on, unwilling to let fear stop their adventure. But with every step deeper into the heart of the park, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. As soon as they stepped into the park, the air changed. The usual sounds of nature, the birds singing and the leaves rustling, seemed to disappear and be replaced by a heavy silence. Suddenly, Sarah felt a chill run down her back, as if the trees were watching them. The path they were walking on was overgrown, and with every step, their boots crunched through the fallen leaves. It felt like the whole area was still, as though time had slowed down. The trees around them grew taller and closer together, and their twisted branches were forming a thick canopy that blocked most of the sunlight. It was like the world had become darker the farther they walked. Laura and Ethan were laughing and they were excited as always, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Every now and then, she thought she saw something move out of the corner of her eye, a shadow behind a tree or a shape just out of reach. "Did you see that?" Sarah asked and her voice was trembling. Laura turned to look but shrugged. "What? Just the wind. Don't be so scared. It is just a forest." But Sarah wasn't so sure. The air felt heavy, like something was in the shadows and they were watching them. It wasn't a peaceful forest where the sounds of nature made you feel calm. So Sarah felt this forest felt old and ancient, and that made her nervous. As they walked deeper into the forest, the path got narrower. The trees crowded around them more, and the shadows grew longer, stretching out like dark hands. Then Ethan stopped suddenly. "What is that?" he asked and pointed to something half buried near the base of a tree. Sarah's heart skipped. It was an animal track, but not one she recognized. It was big, with deep claw marks, almost too deep for any normal animal. The track led off the path and into the thick bushes, and Sarah's pulse raced. "I don't like it here," she whispered, a cold sweat forming on her forehead. "Come on," Ethan said, brushing it off. "It is just an animal, let's keep going." But Sarah couldn't stop feeling that something was wrong. The deeper they went, the more it felt like they weren't supposed to be there. The silence around them was getting unbearable, and then they heard a distant rustling. But it wasn't the sound of an animal moving through the trees. It felt like something was waiting. The sun had set, and the forest was now dark and heavy. The group had set up camp in a small clearing, and the fire flickered, casting shadows on the ground. Everything outside the circle of light felt far away, and they were swallowed by the darkness. As they sat around the fire, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see a shadow move between the trees. The wind had picked up, and the branches above creaked in the cold air. "I am getting a strange feeling about this place," Sarah said quietly. "It feels like something's out there." Laura, her face glowing in the firelight, smiled and threw another log onto the flames. "You are just scared. It is a forest. Relax." But Sarah noticed the unease in Laura's eyes. Ethan sat quietly and stared into the flames with a distant look on his face. The night felt heavy, and the fire seemed small, like it could be put out by the darkness at any moment. Then, a sound half a whisper and half a rustle echoed through the trees. It wasn't the wind. It sounded too deliberate, too careful. "Did you hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Laura nodded, her eyes wide. "Yeah, what wastes that?" Ethan stood up, looking pale. "I will check it out," he said, grabbing a flashlight from his bag. Sarah's heart raced as she watched him disappear into the dark. She could hear his footsteps on the forest floor, but the silence around them made them seem far away. Minutes passed, and Sarah felt the weight of the night closing in. The trees, once tall and impressive, now looked threatening, and their twisted branches were reached for the sky. Suddenly, the whisper returned, louder, closer, like it was moving around them. "Ethan," Laura called out into the darkness. Her voice was shaky, but there was no answer. A chill ran down Sarah's spine as a shadow moved just beyond the firelight. She couldn't tell what it was, but it was there, watching them. The mood in the camp had changed, and the air felt heavier. Later, Ethan had come back, and his face was pale, and walking quickly. He didn't say anything at first, just sat down by the fire, his eyes looking nervously at the trees. "Ethan, what happened?" Laura asked. "What did you see?" Ethan swallowed hard. "I'm not sure. I thought I saw something moving out there, but it wasn't an animal." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, leaning forward. Her stomach tightened. "I don't know," Ethan said. "It looked like a person, but something was wrong. It was too tall, and it was moving really fast. I couldn't see it clearly, but I felt like it was hunting me." Then, the camp went silent. The fire crackled, but the noise only made the forest feel more quiet and heavy. "I think we should leave," Sarah whispered. Laura shook her head. "We can't leave. We came here to camp, and we are not going to let some weird story scare us." Ethan nodded, but looked unsure. "I agree, but maybe we should stay close and no one should go off alone." "But I am not staying here," Sarah said firmly. Her heart was racing. "Something's wrong with this place. I feel it." The others looked at each other and were unsure. They had come for an adventure, but now fear was creeping in. No one spoke for a while, and all they could hear was the crackling fire and the soft rustling of the trees. Finally, Laura broke the silence. She said, "We will stay one more night," her voice strong but not convincing. "But if anything else happens, we leave." Sarah didn't think it would be that easy. The night felt like it had just begun, and she feared it would bring more than just shadows. The second night in Black Hollow was even worse than Sarah expected. The air got colder, as the darkness grew deeper, pressing in from every side. The whispering sounds came back, louder and clearer than before. It felt like the forest was alive, and the trees were talking in a language one could understand. Ethan was keeping watch by the fire, sitting alone and looking around the woods. Sarah, tired but too scared to sleep, lay in her sleeping bag, But sleep was impossible because every little noise made her heart race, and she couldn't stop thinking about the strange events from the night before. The shadows in the trees felt thicker, like something was out there watching them. Then, around midnight, something horrible happened. Sarah woke up to a loud and terrifying scream. It wasn't just any scream, it was a scream full of pure fear, the kind that made your bones shake. Then, Sarah sat up quickly and looking around, but she couldn't see anything in the thick darkness. "Ethan," Laura shouted, jumping out of her tent. "What wastes that?" But there was no answer. The group rushed to the edge of the clearing, calling for Ethan, but he was gone. The fire had almost gone out, casting strange shadows across the campsite. His flashlight was on the ground, still flickering. "Ethan," Sarah called, but her voice was full of fear. Her heart pounded in her chest as she looked around the shadows, but there was no sign of him. It was like he had disappeared into the night. "Where did he go?" Laura whispered. "He couldn't just disappear." Sarah's mind raced, but all she could do was stare into the darkness, feeling scared and helpless. They had to find him. They had to. Then they searched for what felt like hours, calling his name. But the forest stayed silent, as if laughing at their fear. The deeper they went into the woods, the stranger it felt. The trees seemed to get closer, and their twisted branches were reaching out like skeleton fingers. Then, just as Sarah was about to give up, she saw something strange. Blood spattered on the ground, leading into the thick bushes. "Over here," she whispered, and her voice was shaking. Then she said, "I think I found something." Then they followed the trail, and their hearts was racing, until they found something that made Sarah's stomach turn. Ethan's jacket, torn and thrown on the ground under a twisted tree. But there were no signs of him. No footprints, no trace of him anywhere. It was like he had been taken. The search for Ethan went on, but it felt like the forest was tricking them. They searched 4 hours, and the woods just got thicker and darker. The more they walked, the more strange and scary it became. Suddenly, they felt something didn't feel right. The trees felt wrong in a way that made Sarah feel uncomfortable. Some of the tree bark looked scratched, like something had clawed at it. And the scratches were deep, not like animal marks, but more like something on purpose. They spiraled up the trunks, almost like a warning. Then, Laura said, "Look at this," her voice scared. She knelt next to a big oak tree and pointed to strange marks carved into the bark. They looked like symbols. Curved, jagged lines that didn't make sense. At first, Sarah thought they were just random marks, but then she realized they seemed to form a pattern, like some kind of language. Sarah said quietly, "These aren't natural. These look carved." As she leaned closer, the hair on the back of her neck stood up. There was something wrong about these marks. "We need to get out of here," Laura said, and her voice was shaky, stepping back from the tree. "This isn't just a normal forest. Something's wrong here." But they couldn't leave without finding Ethan. The more they searched, the more they realized they didn't know where they were anymore. The forest seemed to change around them, and the trees stood silently, watching their fear grow. Then, just as they were about to turn back, Laura stopped. "Look, over there." Through the trees, Sarah saw something that made her feel cold all over. A pile of old papers, moving slightly in the breeze. Sarah wasn't sure, but her curiosity pulled her closer. Then, they walked carefully toward the papers and stepped on the dry leaves beneath them. The papers were old and worn, but the writing was clear. It looked like a journal. Someone's journal. Sarah picked it up and started flipping through the pages. The entries were strange, written in quick, broken sentences. "They're coming for us. They know we're here. Don't follow the path. If you hear the whispers, run. Don't look back. They are not alone. The woods are alive with them. We were fools to stay." The last page had a smudge that looked like blood. and it made Sarah feel sick. This is from someone else who was here," Sarah whispered, "and they're telling us to leave." Laura's face turned pale, but she said, "We need to find Ethan, now." The morning light brought no relief to Sarah and Laura as they stepped out of the tent, hoping against hope that Ethan might have returned. But the spot where he was last seen looked the same, except for a few leaves rustling quietly in the breeze. Sarah's heart sank, and an empty feeling settled in her stomach as she began to realize he was truly missing. Sarah said maybe he just went exploring and got lost, but even as she spoke, she didn't believe her own words. Ethan was always careful and would never wander off without saying something. Laura looked at Sarah and her eyes were showing the same worrying. She whispered shakily, "We should look for him." They both knew it was risky to separate, but they had no other choice. They quickly packed up and started calling his name as they searched along nearby trails. But the forest stayed silent, almost as if it were hiding him and swallowing their voices before they could reach him. Hours passed, and they were exhausted. Sarah's throat was sore from shouting, and the weight of her backpack seemed heavier with every step. The shadows in the forest grew longer, stretching out like fingers, and the silence felt deeper, more menacing. By afternoon, they had found nothing. No sign of Ethan, no clues, only the heavy, quiet presence of the forest around them. Finally, they returned to their campsite, tired and defeated. Then, Sarah whispered, "We will try again tomorrow." Now they felt the forest was different now, as if it was somehow watching them, curious and perhaps even unfriendly. That night, as they sat close to the small and fading fire, Sarah's mind drifted to the stories she'd heard about this forest. Stories of people who entered and were never seen again. She looked over at Laura, who sat quietly, staring into the flames with a distant, untroubled expression. Suddenly, they heard a soft rustling from the trees behind them. Sarah tensed and gripped her flashlight, while Laura's eyes nervously flicked toward the sound. Then, they exchanged a look, and there was an unspoken understanding between them. They were not alone out here. Something was watching them and hiding just beyond the light. Then, Sarah pointed her flashlight toward the trees, casting long shadows that seemed to move in strange ways. For a moment, she thought she saw something. A figure, or maybe just a shadow standing still among the trees. Suddenly, her breath caught, and she held the flashlight tighter. She whispered to Laura, "Did you see that?" Then it was gone and disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, leaving only the silence of the forest and the sound of their fast breathing. Sarah's heart raced as they sat there, listening for any sign of movement. Every crackle of leaves and every shifting shadow felt unsettling. Just as Sarah started to calm down, she heard it. A faint whisper, soft and distant, just on the edge of her hearing. It almost sounded like Ethan's voice, calling her name. Suddenly, a chill ran down her spine as fear and confusion crept over her. She glanced at Laura, who looked just as unsettled. "Did you hear that?" Sarah asked in a quiet voice. But Laura shook her head and her eyes were darting around the campsite. "Let's just stay close to the fire," she replied, and her voice was shaky. Then they sat in tense silence and their backs pressed against each other, and every sense was alert. The whispering continued, faint and haunting, as if the forest itself was calling to them, pulling them deeper into its dark mystery. As dawn broke, Sarah and Laura were exhausted, and they were barely holding it together after a restless night. The whispering sounds had come and gone, keeping them both on edge. Every time Sarah tried to close her eyes, she felt like someone, or something, was nearby, watching her with an unsettling stare. Laura seemed different that morning, too. Her face was pale, and her eyes kept darting around, watching every shadow. "Sarah," she said quietly, and her voice was uneasy. "Do you think maybe Ethan is playing a trick on us?" Like, maybe this is all just a setup. Sarah shook her head, but Laura's words left her with a flicker of doubt. They were both under so much stress, and the forest's strange and heavy atmosphere only made things worse. Then, a small and uneasy feeling grew in Sarah's mind, making her question everything she knew about Ethan. Had he really disappeared, or was he hiding somewhere, playing on their fears? And then, their conversation turned tense, and each of them was growing suspicious. The forest seemed to feed off their emotions, every shadow and rustling leaf adding to their fear. As they argued, Sarah felt her pulse quicken, her calm thoughts slipping away, replaced by a deep, instinctive fear. What if Hayes, out there, watching us right now? Laura whispered so softly Sarah could barely hear. Sarah swallowed and her mind was racing. She knew she needed to stay calm, but the fear was getting stronger, clouding her thoughts, and making her feel vulnerable in the forest's strange, haunting presence. By midday, Sarah and Laura's fragile bond was starting to crack under the weight of fear and mistrust. They hadn't spoken 4 hours, each wrapped in her own worried thoughts. The silence felt intense, making every little sound louder. The snapping of branches, the rustling of leaves, the eerie creak of swaying trees. Then, they felt the forest was alive as if it had its own heartbeat. As they walked along a narrow path and hoped to find something familiar to guide them back, Laura suddenly stopped. "Look," she whispered and pointed to the ground. Then, Sarah followed her gaze and gasped. A set of footprints, partly hidden by leaves. They looked fresh and definitely human. Could it be Ethan? Sarah asked, and her voice filled with fragile hope. Then, Laura crouched down to examine the footprints. She said maybe, but they are leading deeper into the forest. Do we really want to follow them? Sarah hesitated, but deep down, she felt they couldn't just leave. We can't abandon him, not like this, she said, even as a chill crept up her spine. They both knew it was risky, but the thought of leaving Ethan behind felt wrong, and they had to at least try to find him. Then, they followed the trail carefully, and each step felt heavier than the last. The forest grew darker, with the thick canopy above blocking out the sunlight, casting everything in an unsettling twilight. Then they thought shadows seemed to shift around them, and every crackle of leaves felt like a whisper. Eventually, they reached a small clearing where the footprints suddenly stopped. In the center lay a torn. There was a familiar backpack. It was Ethan's. Sarah rushed forward, and her heart was racing, and knelt beside it. She saw the pack was empty, as if someone had searched through it, taking only what they wanted and leaving the rest. Laura murmured, "Why would he leave his backpack here?" glancing around nervously. Now the air felt thick and tense, as if something unseen was watching them from the shadows. As Sarah looked through the backpack, she found a small notebook tucked into a hidden pocket. Then, she opened it and her eyes were scanning the pages, filled with Ethan's messy handwriting. The notes were scattered and frantic, talking about strange things he had seen. The feeling of being watched and strange symbols etched into trees. One entry made Sarah's blood run cold. "They are watching and I don't know if I will make it out. If anyone finds this, beware the shadows, because they aren't just shadows." Finding Ethan's notes cast a heavy shadow over Sarah and Laura. They exchanged a look, and they both were understanding without words. They weren't alone, and whatever was watching them wasn't human. Laura's eyes darted around the clearing. She whispered, "Maybe we should go back," hugging herself tightly. "This place, it feels wrong." Sarah nodded, but she couldn't shake the thought of Ethan. He was still out there somewhere, maybe trying to survive. But her instincts warned her that staying here was dangerous, that they were dealing with something they couldn't understand. As they decided to turn to leave, they heard a faint rustling in the trees behind them. Suddenly, they froze, and fear gripped them. Slowly, they looked back, peering into the dark forest. Then they saw a figure appear, shadowy and strange, almost like a mirage in the dim light. It was tall, with limbs that bent at odd angles. Sarah whispered, "Run," but Laura was already sprinting through the trees. Sarah followed and her heart was pounding, the forest a blur around her. They stumbled and tripped over roots, but fear and adrenaline pushed them on. Then they heard that whispers followed, louder and more urgent, as if the forest itself was calling them. Shadows flickered at the edges of their vision, darting between trees and moving impossibly fast. Sarah didn't dare look back because she was afraid of what she might see. After what felt like hours, they broke into another clearing and gasping for breath. But as they looked around, dread filled them. They were back where they had started. They saw Ethan's backpack lay on the ground as if mocking them. Laura cried, "No, no, this can't be happening." Clutching her head, the forest seemed to press in closer, the shadows darker and heavier. The feeling of being trapped, of being played with, was overwhelming. A terrifying thought crossed Sarah's mind. The forest won't let us leave, and it has already chosen our fate. Hours passed, and it was impossible to tell time in the forest's strange and endless twilight. Then, Sarah and Laura sat together, and their backs pressed against a tree, hoping it would somehow protect them from the unknown things in the shadows. Now both were exhausted and terrified. Laura sat curled up with her knees to her chest, slightly rocking, and her eyes were wide and unfocused. Sarah tried to stay calm, but every sound and every movement in the trees made her heart race. Then, Laura whispered, "Do you think we are even real anymore?" Her voice hollow and distant. Sarah's throat tightened, and she wanted to comfort Laura, to say they'd make it out, but even she was starting to doubt. The forest seemed to reach inside her and filled her with a dread she couldn't shake. She wasn't sure of anything anymore, not the reality around them, not even her own mind. As dusk settled, they decided to move and hope to escape the stillness. And then they picked a direction and began stumbling through the thick forest, driven by a desperate need to escape. But each step grew heavier, like the forest was trying to hold them back. Then they saw it, a faint glow through the trees, like a small fire in the distance, and Sarah's heart leapt. Could it help? A campsite, a ranger station. Then they rushed toward the lights and stepped into a clearing. In the center was a ring of blackened stones, like a fire pit from long ago. Strange symbols were carved into the ground around the stones, glowing faintly. Laura backed away and her face was pale. What is this?" Sarah didn't answer, and her eyes were fixed on the symbols. A deep sense of fear washed over her, as if they had found something forbidden, something they should have never seen. The light around them grew brighter, casting strange shadows that twisted and seemed to move on their own. A low hum filled the air and vibrated through them. Then, Sarah's vision was blurred and the world was spinning as the whispers grew louder, filling her mind with strange words she couldn't understand. And then she clutched her head and felt the thought echo inside her mind. "They are here, and they will not let us go." Then, Sarah and Laura stared at the glowing symbols and tried to understand what they were seeing. The hum in the air grew louder, vibrating deep within them, and they felt an odd pull toward the ring of stones. It was as if the symbols were calling to them and drawing them closer. Then, Laura whispered, "Sarah, what's happening?" Clutching Sarah's arm tightly. Sarah murmured, I don't know." A strange fog seemed to cloud her mind and blurred her thoughts, and part of her wanted to run and pulled Laura away from this place. But another part, the part growing stronger by the second, wanted to stay and uncover the mystery within the circle. Without fully realizing it, Sarah took a step forward. The world seemed to shift around her, and the trees melted into dark shapes. She felt the weight of the forest pushing her toward the center of the circle. Laura tried to pull her back, but Sarah's feet moved on their own, one step after another. until she was standing inside the ring of stones. Suddenly, a heavy silence fell over the clearing. The symbols on the ground glowed with a sickly green light and casting an eerie glow on Sarah's face. She felt warmth spreading through her, mixed with a deep sense of dread. It was as if the forest itself was welcoming her, as if it knew her. Laura watched in horror, and her eyes were wide with fear. "Sarah, please, come back. This isn't right." But Sarah couldn't move. She was trapped and her body was rooted in place. Then, she felt something ancient and powerful watching her, as if she were being studied by unseen eyes. Then, a cold and distant voice echoed in her mind. "You have come to us, willingly. The forest accepts your offering." Then Sarah's heart raced and her mind was trying to make sense of the words. Offering. She hadn't come here willingly. Or had she? A wave of horror washed over her as she realized. She couldn't remember why she had entered the forest. Her reasons, her memories. They were slipping away, leaving her hollow, as if she were losing pieces of herself. Laura's voice broke through the haze, desperate and pleading. "Sarah, snap out of it. We have to live, now." With a tremendous effort, Sarah looked at Laura and broke free from the pull of the symbols. She stumbled out of the circle and gasping for air, as if she had just escaped something unspeakable. The moment she stepped outside the ring, the symbols dimmed, and the heaviness in the air lifted slightly. But Sarah knew, deep down, that they hadn't truly escaped. The forest had let her go this time, but it felt like only a brief and fragile mercy. They walked in silence, and the memory of the strange ritual was weighing on them. Sarah still felt the eerie warmth from the ring of stones, and she had a nagging feeling that something was watching them. She kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see a shadowy figure following them. Laura finally whispered, What was that back there?" Sarah shook her head and struggled to explain. "I don't know, but it felt like the forest wanted something from me. Like it was testing me." Laura shivered and wrapped her arms around herself. "This isn't just a forest, Sarah. It feels alive, and it's hungry." Then they tried to put distance between them and the ritual site, but the forest seemed to close in tighter, twisting and warping around them. The familiar path they had been following started to vanish, replaced by strange shapes in the dark. Then the whispers started again, faint at first, blending with the rustling leaves. But as they kept walking, the whispers grew louder. It sounded like 1,000 hidden voices surrounding them, watching and waiting. Sarah asked, "Did you hear that?" Her voice barely steady. Laura nodded and her face was pale. "They are whispering our names. I can hear them." Suddenly, a chill went down Sarah's spine. She tried to ignore the voices, but they grew louder and filled her mind with strange and disturbing images. A hand reaching from the darkness, a face twisted in terror, and shadows creeping across the ground. Suddenly, Laura stopped and her face was filled with fear. Then, she pointed ahead and her hand was shaking. Look, in shadows, they saw Ethan standing and his face was pale and his eyes were vacant, staring at them with an intensity that made Sarah's skin crawl. He stood perfectly still, his body stiff, as if he were a puppet controlled by invisible strings. Sarah called Ethan, her voice trembling, but he didn't answer and he just stood there and his face was blank and lifeless. This wasn't the Ethan they knew. He looked empty. Laura whispered, "We need to leave," pulling on Sarah's arm. "Now." But as they turned to run, Ethan's voice echoed through the trees, low and chilling. "You can't leave, not now. The forest has claimed you." Sarah's heart pounded as she realized the awful truth. Ethan wasn't himself anymore. He was just a voice, controlled by whatever dark force ruled this forest. They were trapped, bound to this cursed place, and there was no way out. Then they ran and their feet was pounding on the forest floor, with the eerie whispers close behind them. Sarah's mind spun with fear and confusion, haunted by the image of Ethan's empty stare and his chilling words. The forest had taken him, and it felt like it was coming for them too. Branches seemed to reach out like bony hands, scratching their arms and legs as they pushed through the thick underbrush. The trees seemed to shift, bending to block their path, forcing them deeper into the forest. Finally, they stumbled into another clearing, breathing hard. But this place was different. It was completely silent, no rustling leaves, no distant animal sounds. The air felt heavy, and strange symbols were carved into the ground, like the ones at the ritual site. Laura sank to her knees, her face buried in her hands. She whispered, "We are not getting out of here." Sarah put a hand on her shoulder and tried to comfort her, but she felt just as lost. The forest seemed to trap them tighter with every step, and there was no clear way out. As they sat in silence, the shadows around them began to shift, forming strange and twisted shapes. Faces appeared in the darkness, with eyes full of ancient anger. The whispers grew louder and filled the air with a chilling chant. The voices murmured, "Join us," blending into one haunting sound. The forced her waits. Suddenly, Sarah felt a cold hand grip her wrist and pulled her toward the center of the clearing. She tried to pull away, but her body felt heavy, as if the forest itself was holding her down. She looked at Laura, who was staring back in terror. They both knew they were out of time. The shadows closed in and wrapped around them like a thick, dark fog, pulling them deeper into the forest's dark heart. Their screams vanished into the darkness, swallowed by the forest, and then silence. In the days that followed, search parties combed the forest, but they found no sign of Sarah, Laura, or Ethan. It was as if they had vanished, leaving only whispered rumors and a feeling of dread. Even now, the locals avoid that part of the forest. They warn travelers about the whispers, the shadows, and the cursed souls who were taken by the forest, never to return. If you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Please share this video with your friends and family too. Thanks.